I never expected to find it. Not there, not then, not ever. But life has a strange way of revealing its secrets at the most unexpected moments. It was Thanksgiving, and like every year, my entire family had gathered at my parents' suburban home in Connecticut. The crisp November air carried the scent of fallen leaves and chimney smoke as I pulled into the driveway. Mom had been cooking since dawn, her famous turkey cranberry sauce from scratch, and pumpkin pies cooling on the windowsill. Dad was in his element, greeting everyone with firm handshakes and warm hugs, a glass of bourbon perpetually in hand. "There she is," he called out as I stepped through the front door, my arms laden with hastily wrapped gifts and a bottle of wine. "Our big city journalist finally remembers where she came from." I forced a smile. 8 months in New York had changed me in ways my family couldn't understand. Or perhaps they understood all too well and simply didn't approve. My sister Elaine was already there with her husband Mark, and their 2 perfectly behaved children. So was my younger brother Tom, recently graduated and already talking about law school. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert arrived shortly after, along with my cousins and their respective partners. A perfect American family gathering, at least on the surface. Dinner was a carefully choreographed performance of passing dishes, complimenting the food, and engaging in superficial conversation about work, weather, and neighborhood gossip. Politics remained carefully off-limits after the disaster of 2020's Thanksgiving argument. We'd all silently agreed to keep things pleasant, if not entirely genuine. "Emma, would you mind getting the good napkins from the sideboard?" Mom asked as we were setting the table. "They're in the second drawer." I nodded and made my way to the antique sideboard that had belonged to my grandmother. The drawer stuck slightly as I pulled it open. Mom's good napkins were embroidered linen, used only for special occasions and holidays. As I lifted the stack, something slipped from beneath them, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded it carefully, expecting perhaps an old recipe or a forgotten note. Instead, I found myself staring at a letter, handwritten in my father's distinctive slanted script. It was dated 15 years ago. "Emma, those napkins?" Mom called from the dining room. "Coming," I replied automatically, my eyes still scanning the words on the page. Words that made my blood run cold. The letter was addressed to my mother. It began formally, almost coldly. "Catherine, I need to make something clear." What followed were 3 pages of the most venomous, bitter accusations I'd ever read. Dad accused Mom of destroying his dreams, of trapping him in a marriage he never wanted, of using the children, using us, as weapons against him. He described in painful detail how he'd planned to leave, had even found an apartment in Boston, had been seeing someone else, someone who understood him in ways Catherine never could. The final paragraph was the worst. "I stay only for the children. When they're grown, I'll finally be free of you." My hands trembled as I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. I grabbed the napkins and returned to the dining room, where everyone was gathering around the table. Dad stood at the head, carving knife in hand, smiling broadly as he prepared to slice the turkey. Mom was beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, a picture of domestic harmony. "There you are," Dad said, looking up at me. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I lied, taking my seat. "Just hungry." Throughout dinner, the letter burned in my pocket like a live coal. I watched my parents interact, the casual touches, the inside jokes, the way they finished each other's sentences. Was it all an act? Had they been pretending for 15 years? Or had something changed since Dad wrote those cruel words? As dessert was served, I excused myself and stepped out onto the back porch. The night was cold, stars sharp points of light in the clear sky. I pulled out the letter and read it again, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood, that there was context I was missing. But the words remained unchanged, brutal in their clarity. The door opened behind me, and I quickly shoved the letter back into my pocket. Bit cold to be stargazing, isn't it? It was Tom, my brother, offering me a steaming mug of coffee. I accepted it gratefully. Just needed some air. He stood beside me, looking out at the darkened yard. "You've been quiet all evening. Something on your mind?" I hesitated. Tom had always been perceptive, even as a child. "Have you ever discovered something about our parents that Changed how you see them? He laughed softly. Like finding out Dad wasn't actually a superhero, or that Mom doesn't actually have eyes in the back of her head. Something more serious, I said. Tom's smile faded. What's going on, Em? Before I could answer, the door opened again, and Dad stepped out. There you two are. Your mother's about to serve the pumpkin pie, and you know how she gets if we're not all seated for her grand finale. I looked at him. Really looked at him, searching his face for signs of the man who had written that letter. All I saw was my father, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled, a bit more gray at his temples than last year, but still unmistakably the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who had cried at my college graduation. We'll be right in, I said, forcing another smile. Dad nodded and went back inside. Tom gave me a curious look but didn't press further. As I stepped back into the warm house, the letter felt heavier in my pocket. I had a choice to make: confront my parents with this painful truth, or bury it back where I found it, preserving the peace of our family dinner. And perhaps much more. Little did I know that this letter was just the beginning, a single thread that, once pulled, would unravel the carefully constructed tapestry of lies that had shaped my entire childhood. I couldn't sleep that night. The letter sat on the nightstand in my old bedroom, its presence almost palpable in the darkness. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the neighborhood with white. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar crack that had been there since I was a child, shaped like a lightning bolt. How many nights had I lain in this same position, believing I understood my family, my childhood, my parents' relationship? By morning, I had made my decision. I needed answers. The house was quiet when I came downstairs. Mom was in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast. Dad would be out for his morning walk, a ritual he'd maintained for as long as I could remember. "Morning, sweetheart," Mom said without turning around. She always knew which of her children had entered a room, another one of her mysterious maternal powers. Coffee's fresh. I poured myself a cup, the familiar routine feeling suddenly foreign. "Mom, can we talk?" Something in my tone made her turn. She wiped her hands on her apron and studied my face. "What's wrong?" I placed the letter on the kitchen island between us. For a moment, she didn't seem to recognize it. Then her face changed, subtle shifts in expression that I might have missed if I hadn't been watching so closely. Recognition, shock, fear, and finally, a profound sadness. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. "In the sideboard, under the napkins." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "I thought I'd burned it years ago. So you've read it?" "Of course I've read it." She pulled out a stool and sat down heavily. "Your father never gave it to me, if that's what you're wondering. He wrote it during a difficult time. I found it in his desk. When? About 15 years ago, like the date says. And you stayed? After reading these things he wrote about you. About your marriage." Mom sighed, looking suddenly older. "Marriage isn't what you see in movies, Emma. It's not always romantic gestures and passionate declarations. Sometimes it's just enduring. Enduring cruelty? Betrayal?" I felt anger rising in my throat. "He was having an affair, Mom. He was planning to leave you. I know what he did." Her voice hardened slightly. "I've had 15 years to come to terms with it. But why stay? Why pretend everything was fine? We deserve to know the truth. Did you?" Mom's eyes met mine, challenging. "Did you deserve to have your family torn apart? To have your image of your father destroyed? To be forced to choose sides?" I had no answer for that. Your father never gave me that letter because he never meant for me to see it. It was catharsis, I suppose. Writing down his darkest thoughts during his darkest moment. That doesn't excuse— "I'm not excusing anything," she interrupted. "What your father did was wrong. The things he wrote were cruel, but people are complicated, Emma. Even parents." The back door opened, and Dad stepped in, bringing with him the crisp scent of winter air. He stomped snow from his boots, chattering about the beautiful morning, before noticing the tension in the kitchen. His eyes fell on the letter, and the color drained from his face. "Catherine," he began, but seemed unable to continue. "Emma found your letter," Mom said simply. Dad looked between us, his expression stricken. "That was never meant to be read, yet here we are," I said coldly. He removed his coat and sat down at the table, as if preparing himself for a long conversation. "I wrote that letter during the worst period of my life. I was unhappy, confused. I made terrible choices. You were cheating on Mom. Yes." He didn't try to deny it. "For about 6 months, with a colleague from work, and you were going to leave us." The betrayal felt fresh, as if it had happened yesterday rather than 15 years ago. "I thought about it," he admitted. "I even took steps toward it, but I never could have gone through with it." "The letter says otherwise." Dad looked at Mom, something passing between them that I couldn't interpret. "After your mother found that letter, we had the most honest conversation of our marriage. Painful, but necessary. She had every right to throw me out, to divorce me on the spot. Instead, she gave me a choice: commit completely to rebuilding what I'd broken, or leave and never come back." Mom reached across the table and took his hand. The gesture seemed so incongruous with what we were discussing that I almost laughed. "We went to counseling," Mom said. "For 3 years. We did the work, Emma, both of us. Your father's affair was a symptom, not the disease. Our marriage had problems long before that. Problems we'd both contributed to." "So that's it. Therapy fixed everything and we all pretend it never happened?" "No," Dad said firmly. "We don't pretend it never happened. We acknowledge it, learn from it, and move forward. That's what adults do when they make mistakes, even terrible ones." I felt tears stinging my eyes. How can I trust anything about this family now? How do I know what's real and what's just another performance? "Oh, sweetheart," Mom's voice softened. "The family you grew up in was real. The love was real. The good memories, those camping trips, the Christmas mornings, the birthdays, all real. But so were the struggles, the arguments, the times when your father and I could barely look at each other. We just tried to shield you kids from the worst of it. Maybe that was our mistake," Dad added. "Maybe we should have been more honest about how hard marriage can be. How people can hurt each other deeply and still find their way back." I looked between them, these strangers who were my parents. "Does Elaine know? Or Tom?" They exchanged glances. "No," Mom said. "You're the first." That somehow made it worse, being alone with this knowledge. "I need time to process this." "Of course," Dad said. "But Emma, please understand something. That letter represents the worst version of me, a version I've spent 15 years trying to leave behind. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to judge me by the entirety of my life, not just its lowest point." I stood up, needing space. "I'm going for a walk." Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now. I walked without direction, my mind replaying moments from my childhood, examining them for signs I might have missed. The tension at dinner tables, the muffled arguments behind closed doors, the periods when Dad worked late night after night. Had I been willfully blind, or just a child who trusted her parents? When I returned to the house hours later, cold and emotionally exhausted, I found my brother Tom sitting on the front steps, waiting for me. "They told me," he said simply, "about the letter, about everything." I sat beside him, our shoulders touching. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I think people make mistakes, even parents. Maybe especially parents." "That's it? Dad cheats on Mom, plans to abandon the family, and it's just a mistake?" "No," Tom said thoughtfully. "It's a series of terrible choices that could have destroyed our family, but it didn't. They chose to stay, to work through it. That counts for something, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. In the silence between us, snow continued to fall, covering the past with a clean white blanket. Later that evening, as the family gathered for leftovers, the atmosphere was different. The easy conversation was gone, replaced by a wary politeness. Elaine, who had also been told, kept shooting concerned glances between our parents. Only the children remained oblivious, arguing happily about which Christmas movie to watch after dinner. I watched my father help my mother clear the table, their movements around each other practiced and familiar. When he thought no one was looking, he placed his hand on the small of her back, and she leaned into him slightly. It was a tiny gesture, but genuine. Not performed for anyone's benefit. Perhaps that was the difference between the man who wrote that letter and the man standing in the kitchen now. One had been consumed by his own unhappiness, willing to burn everything down to escape it. The other had learned to find contentment in the life he had chosen, or perhaps re-chosen. I still didn't know if I could forgive him. But I was beginning to understand that forgiveness wasn't the only path forward. Sometimes, acknowledgement is enough. Recognition of hurt caused and amends attempted. The messy, complicated reality of family life, not the sanitized version I'd believed in, but something more human, more real. That night, I sat down at my old desk and began to write. Not a letter, but the beginning of understanding. The first steps toward a new relationship with my parents, one based not on idealization or resentment, but on the complicated truth of who they really were. Spring came late to Connecticut that year. It was early April, almost 5 months since Thanksgiving, when I returned to my parents' house. The daffodils were just beginning to push through the soil, bright splashes of yellow against the still dormant lawn. I'd kept my distance since the holidays, processing the revelation in my own way. Weekly phone calls with Mom, shorter conversations with Dad. A few family Zoom sessions that felt like performances, everyone careful, measured, walking on eggshells around the elephant in the room. Elaine had reverted to her role as peacekeeper, while Tom had become more philosophical than ever, sending me long, rambling texts about forgiveness and the nature of truth. But distance and time had given me perspective. After the initial shock and betrayal had faded, I'd begun to examine my own relationships, particularly my failed engagement to Michael 2 years prior. How close had I come to making similarly devastating choices? How many cruel thoughts had I written down or spoken aloud in moments of frustration or fear? The answers weren't comfortable. Mom met me at the door with a warm hug. "Perfect timing," she said. "Your father's just fired up the grill. First barbecue of the season." Dad was in the backyard, spatula in hand, looking oddly vulnerable in his kiss the cook apron. When he saw me, his face lit up, then immediately became guarded, unsure of my reception. "Hey, Dad," I said, offering a small smile. Relief flooded his features. "Hey, kiddo, burger or chicken?" "Both," I replied, and his laugh was genuine. After dinner, Mom conveniently remembered some calls she needed to make, leaving Dad and me alone on the back porch. The evening was cool but pleasant, the scent of new growth hanging in the air. "I've been seeing a therapist," I told him after a comfortable silence, trying to understand why the letter affected me so deeply. Dad nodded, waiting for me to continue. I think I'd put you and Mom on a pedestal. Perfect parents, perfect marriage. Finding out it wasn't true felt like losing something essential. "I'm sorry for that," he said quietly. "We never wanted to be perfect, just good enough." My therapist says that children need to see their parents as fallible humans to fully mature themselves. Dad smiled slightly. Smart therapist. She also says I need to stop avoiding the hard conversations. He raised an eyebrow. "Like this one?" "Like this one," I agreed. "Dad, I need to know, are you happy now? Really happy? Not just pretending for our benefit?" He considered the question carefully, looking out at the yard where Tom, Elaine, and I had played as children. "Happiness is a complicated thing, Emma. I spent a lot of my early life chasing a version of it that I thought would feel bigger, more dramatic, more like the movies." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "What I've found instead is contentment, appreciation. Your mother and I have built something that's weathered storms, including ones of my making. When I look at her now, I see someone who knows the worst of me and chose to stay anyway. There's a profound intimacy in that." "But do you love her?" I pressed. "Not just appreciation or obligation, but love. More now than ever," he said without hesitation. "It's a different kind of love than when we started. Deeper, more rooted in reality. Less passionate sometimes, yes, but more enduring." I thought about that, about my own failed relationships built on intensity rather than sustainability. "I've been so angry with you," I admitted. "You had every right to be. I'm not finished," I said, surprising myself with my firmness. I've been angry because you shattered my illusions. But maybe I needed them shattered. Maybe understanding that even good people can make terrible mistakes, can hurt those they love most deeply, and still find their way back. Maybe that's a more valuable lesson than the fantasy I was clinging to. Dad's eyes were shining with unshed tears. You always were the wisest of my children. I laughed softly. Don't let Tom hear you say that. He thinks his philosophy degree makes him the family sage. Dad reached over and took my hand, his grip firm and familiar. I need you to know something, Emma. That letter, it represents the worst moment of my life. Not because I got caught, but because I almost threw away everything that truly mattered. I look back at that man with a mixture of pity and horror. Do you ever think about her? The other woman? I asked, finally voicing the question that had haunted me. Dad shook his head. Honestly, no. She wasn't the cause of our problems, just a symptom. After your mother and I decided to rebuild, I transferred to a different department, cut all contact. Last I heard, years ago, she'd moved to Seattle. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. From inside the house came the sound of Mom's laughter. She must have finished her calls and was probably looking through old photo albums, as she often did when feeling nostalgic. I have one more question, I said. If Mom hadn't found that letter, if things had continued as they were, would you really have left? Dad was quiet for a long time. I don't know, he finally admitted. I'd like to think I would have come to my senses, recognized what I was throwing away. But the truth is, people rarely see clearly when they're in the midst of unhappiness. That's why your mother finding that letter was probably the best thing that could have happened. It forced us to confront what wasn't working instead of continuing to ignore it. I nodded, understanding. Thank you for being honest, even now when it would be easier not to be. No more secrets, he promised. No more pretending. Later that night, I found Mom in the kitchen, making her famous hot chocolate, a family tradition regardless of season. She handed me a steaming mug topped with tiny marshmallows, just as she had throughout my childhood. Good talk with your father? She asked. Yes, I said, but I'd like to hear your side too. Not just about the affair, but about everything. The real story of your marriage, the good, the bad, all of it. Mom smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. That might take more than one hot chocolate. I've got time, I said, settling into a kitchen chair, and so she began, telling me stories I'd never heard before. About their early struggles with money, about the time she'd almost left him when I was a baby, about the grief of her miscarriage before Tom was born, about the year they'd barely spoken to each other except about household logistics, but also about moments of profound connection, of partnership through crises, of rediscovering each other after the kids were grown. It was well past midnight when we finished talking. The kitchen was dark except for the small light above the stove. Mom looked tired but somehow lighter, as if sharing these truths had unburdened her in some way. I hope this doesn't change how you see marriage, she said as we rinsed our mugs. Despite everything, it's been worth it. Actually, I think it gives me hope, I told her. The fairy tale version never quite worked for me anyway. The next morning, before leaving to drive back to New York, I returned to the sideboard where I'd found the letter. The drawer still stuck slightly when pulled. Inside, beneath the good napkins, I placed a sealed envelope of my own, not addressed to either of my parents, but to myself. Inside was a letter I'd written the night before, a record of this moment of understanding, of seeing my parents clearly for perhaps the first time. One day, years from now, I might find it again and remember how a family dinner and a hidden letter had changed everything, not by destroying what I thought I knew, but by replacing it with something more complex, more difficult, and ultimately more true. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw my parents standing together on the porch, Mom's head resting against Dad's shoulder, his arm around her waist. They weren't a perfect couple. They weren't even the couple I'd believed them to be for most of my life. But they were real, and somehow that meant more than perfection ever could.